the differences between the English and Japanese version of the adventure log, and how the original can be read from Link's perspective in Breath of the Wild was a topic I explored in my first ever video on this channel. I explained that not only can the quest entries be read in the first person, as if Link is writing and updating them himself, but it also seems he sometimes records extra details and his personal thoughts on things that happen throughout his adventure. Details that are absent in the English release, which is written in the second person, addressing the reader as you. In this way, the original Japanese version of the adventure log can function as a kind of personal diary for Link. However, there is an explanation that I didn't touch on at all in the first series of videos that I believe is incredibly important to truly understand the actual nature and complexity of the Japanese adventure log. While there are plenty of differences between the original Japanese and localized English version, it isn't as simple as one being in first person and the other in the second. To elaborate, it would be unfair and, to be honest, wrong to assume that the people who worked on Breath of the Wild's and Tears of the Kingdom's localization purposely removed any first-person style out of ignorance. These people had an incredibly tough decision to make when deciding how to translate the Japanese entries. So, before we get into Link's diary in Tears of the Kingdom, let me show you some more entries and comparisons between the two versions of Breath of the Wild's log and explain in detail. I believe the reason may give you a different kind of appreciation for the Japanese language and both versions. Like the English language, Japanese has pronouns. However, unlike in English, words such as I and you are often dropped when speaking or writing Japanese. In fact, it's more natural to leave out the sentence subject and limit your use of I or you in Japanese entirely. This is especially true when writing a diary. Therefore, this means that you can speak in Japanese without ever referring to yourself with I or to another person as you. Words for I and you in Japanese do exist, however, they are often very nuanced, and which one should be used depends on one's gender, age, or relationship to the speaker, and so on. In Ocarina of Time, Sheik, who is Zelda in disguise, uses the male-associated pronoun boku to make Sheik's character even more convincing. Of course, this is something that is not possible to replicate in English, simply because these kinds of pronouns do not exist, not to mention the limited space inside the in-game text box. Therefore, it's only natural that in English, Sheik simply refers to themselves with I. To address someone with you in Japanese, it's most common to instead call the person by their name, their profession, or position. For instance, students may address their teacher as sensei, and customer service representatives address customers as just that, customers. A literal translation of staff greeting customers would be something like, "Hello, customer. Can I help you?" Of course, this sounds unnatural in English, hence the need for localization. In the Japanese version of Breath of the Wild, the pronouns for you or I do not appear even once throughout the entire adventure log. There is the occasional appearance of the Japanese word jibun, however, which can mean myself, yourself, I, me, or you in some dialects, and is dependent on the context, which is what's important to focus on first in regards to the quest entries. Let's use the quest Watch Out for the Flowers as an example. Link is required to carefully navigate around the flowers in order to reach a shrine. Should he happen to step on them, he will be scolded by a very angry lady. After successfully reaching the shrine, the quest updates telling you to be careful not to step on flowers from here on out. If we were to translate this into literal Japanese, this is what we would get. Ignoring the slight difference in words and the name of Magna between the Japanese and English version for now, this entry obviously sounds very awkward in English, precisely because in this style of text, English requires a pronoun to feel natural. You're then left to decide which personal pronoun to use. Do you use you or I? As mentioned, the lack of pronoun usage is a natural element of the Japanese language, and you can certainly write a diary in Japanese in the first person without using one. The perspective is often inferred through the writing style. However, there is more to this than just being about pronoun usage. To clarify, the memories in Breath of the Wild's adventure log both feature the name Link when describing a memory he is involved with in both versions. The descriptions are written in the third person and are written in the present tense, like a typical summary of a movie or a story. Therefore, both versions of this part of the slate are in the third person. There is no mistaking that. The quests section of the adventure log, however, is much more complicated, and not just because of the lack of pronouns, but precisely because of the style of language used, and how the Japanese text mostly intentionally avoids speaking to anyone directly. Because the adventure log provides and functions as navigational support for the player, there are quests or sections of quests that are written in a style that feels much more like a guide, or simply just descriptions of a quest's outcome. For instance, take the quest The Weapon Connoisseur, where Link encounters a young child in Hatano Village who is passionate about various weapons and requests that Link show him some. In the English version of this quest, the text is of course written in the second person, directly instructing the player to show him a particular weapon. The text content for this quest in Japanese has no major differences compared to English. It still contains no pronouns, and there is no expressive language, meaning that these kinds of quests can be read in the first or second person. Alternatively, you can opt for a more neutral translation, but to some this may feel somewhat strange, as deciding on a second or first person perspective would probably be more natural for this style of narration in English. While there are numerous completed quest entries within the adventure log that are relatively short in text in both versions, there are several lines in multiple entries that exist in the Japanese version, but not in the English release, due to having been erased during the localization process. These extra pieces of text contain expressive language and personal thoughts that are definitely better read in the first person in my opinion, which would be from Link's perspective. The decision to omit or drastically alter these lines in the English release may be related to how difficult they would have been to render into English without sounding unnatural, due to how the Japanese language is more flexible in this nature, and therefore can better leave it up to interpretation. A key example of this can be found in the Captured Memories quest, where, after regaining all 13 memories, the English quest text states that, in the memories, Princess Zelda always seemed burdened by her task, and that you should go and save her as quickly as you can to ease that burden. The Japanese, however, can be translated differently. Among Japanese fans, the adventure log, and this quest in particular, is largely interpreted as being written by Link, and consequently is one of the biggest pieces of evidence that fuels the discussion about whether or not Link and Zelda had feelings for each other. Hence, I will provide several alternative translations for it, a luxury that the official localizers at Nintendo did not have, and a link to all the sources in the description if you're interested in what Japanese fans think about it all. I travelled to the 13 places of reminiscence and received Princess Zelda's feelings. Within the memories, Princess Zelda was always trying her hardest. I want to rescue Princess Zelda as soon as possible and see her smile once again with my own eyes. You could also opt for a more dramatic style with something like, I journeyed all around to the 13 places of recollection and recovered my memories of Princess Zelda. Within those memories, Princess Zelda was always diligent. I desire to swiftly come to Princess Zelda's aid, and I long to witness her smile once more with these very eyes. The word that I translated as feelings in the first translation is omoi, which is also the same word used in the Japanese version of Memory 18 in Tears of the Kingdom, which is titled Zelda's Wish in English. Given the context of everything, I believe that feelings or wish would both be an appropriate translation for this part of the text. The biggest difference in this entry is this line in Japanese that describes the desire to see Zelda's smile again, which has been localized in English to "go and save her as quickly as you can to finally ease that burden." While the English localization does capture some of the essence of the Japanese to an extent, it isn't quite on the same level, at least in my opinion. It's not that the people who localized the Japanese text wanted to deviate from the first person and the contents of the entry, it's that, due to the nature of the English language, they likely decided that it would sound more natural than something like, "You want to rescue Princess Zelda as soon as possible, and you want to see her smile once again with your own eyes." With that said, I certainly feel like the Japanese version is more impactful because of how personal the language used in the entries feel. Again, something that is challenging to convey in English. To keep true to the original text, we'd also have to find a way to render konome into English, which is what's used for the "my own eyes" part of the quest. It can only mean the author's eyes, as the literal translation is "these eyes," and given that the adventure log is called an adventure pocket notebook in Japanese and is an item that Link holds, it would only make sense for Link to have written it. Somebody in the comments of one of my earlier videos suggested writing it like this: "The sooner she is saved, the better. It would be nice to see her smile once again." I believe that, given everything we've discussed, this kind of neutral translation is very effective as an alternative. There are also instances where personal expressive language is used, in combination with narrational style text within the same quest. The very first quest in the game, Follow the Sheikah Slate, does just that. It combines expressive language and standard narration or guidance in the same entry. It's very clever, actually. By looking at the English text of this quest, you'll see that the narrational element is there already, directing the player to access the map by pressing a button. The Japanese version uses slightly more descriptive language that speaks from a personal perspective in regards to Zelda, which contributes to the reason why it feels very natural to read in the first person. Here's how you could translate it. I heard a beautiful woman's voice from somewhere, directing me to the location indicated on the Sheikah Stones map. This mysterious tablet I acquired upon awakening is something that I should be seeing for the first time, but it feels somewhat familiar. It seems the map can be opened with the minus button. Remember that there are no pronouns present in this text, they are just inferred through the writing style. Here's a clip with subtitles of a Japanese player reading this entry for the first time.
はい、すいません。シーカーストーンですね。シーカーパッドですね。今はここに行けってこと？なんすか冒険手帳って。はあ、どこからか美しい女性の声が聞こえてきた。美しいかどうかは知らんけどね。あ、声が美しいってことか。リンクが勝手に顔を想像して美しい女性って言ってるのかと思った。
If you're interested, I've left a link below to the full clip of the Japanese player reading this for the first time, who interprets this text immediately as Link's own thoughts. In other words, you can choose to read the narrative elements of the entries in either the second or first person in Japanese. The more expressive parts, however, would likely feel more natural to read in the first person, hence the reason why they were omitted from the English release. Sometimes, the boundaries between the first and second person in Japanese can be blurred when there's insufficient context. There's a really fascinating example of this in Breath of the Wild, where Link's inner thoughts are projected in the first person, even in English. This happens in Lurlin Village when Link approaches some fish cooking next to a fire and makes a comment on how tasty they look, an appropriate comment given Link's personality. Looking at the Japanese once again reveals that there are no personal pronouns, which just goes to show how ambiguous Japanese can be. In Japanese, the text is written in the exact same style as the quests in the adventure log. It's possible that the localizers were not given context regarding who was speaking this line, hence their decision to translate it into the first person. For argument's sake, the second person could also work here, but I do like how this piece of text ended up. To clarify, this writing style is the same as the text in the text box that appears whenever Link obtains an item in the game, and is also the same writing style that Zelda uses herself in her own personal diary in the Japanese version of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which further attributes to the complexity of the language. With that said, one of the best things about playing the game in Japanese is that it gives the player the freedom to choose how they interpret a lot of this. Because of the very nature of how Japanese works works as a language, the adventure log in the original release is able to keep the perspective vague by not talking to anyone directly so as to allow the player a choice. Players can choose to project themselves onto Link or to interpret the writings as Link's own thoughts. Many Japanese players seem to have done the latter. This brings us to Tears of the Kingdom, which is similar to Breath of the Wild in that the Japanese text mostly avoids speaking to anyone directly. Once Link has been to all 11 of the geoglyphs across Hyrule, a final 12th becomes available, which reveals Zelda's and the Master Sword's fate in the story. Let's take a look at a possible translation of the Japanese for the Dragon Tears quest once it has been completed. I travel to all of the surface paintings and witness a tear of a dragon. Princess Zelda sacrificed herself and transformed into a white dragon, all to entrust the Master Sword to me. I must do whatever it takes to live up to Princess Zelda's feelings, no matter what. Like Breath of the Wild, there is no appearance of I or you in this entry. On the other hand, unlike Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom seems to have no omitted lines of expressive text between the original and English versions. Furthermore, Tears of the Kingdom's degree of expressive language in general has been noticeably toned down compared to its prequel. Depending on the quest, you could read it as if it were in the first person if you wish to do so, yet there are a number of entries that mention Link's name in the text, which makes everything a little more complex. To reference another main quest as an example, let's take a look at a sludge-covered statue which Link completes after arriving at Zora's domain. You can choose to translate the Japanese in a few ways. If we were to translate it into the first person, it would read like this. When I washed away the sludge that had dirtied the stone statue, to my surprise, it turned out to be a homage to the Zora Prince Cid and Link. The domain's new stone statue was now restored to its pristine state and brought great joy to the Zora people. The issue with reading this quest from Link's perspective is that the text reads as if the writer is describing the statue being of Link and Sidon. It literally uses Link's name within the quest. This would still feel natural to read in the first person if it was a reference to something that someone else had said, but in this case, it's not. With the exception of young Japanese children who sometimes refer to themselves by their name, people usually use the word me or I or nothing at all when talking about themselves as the subject of a sentence. In other words, if this was Link's own words, it would feel more natural for him to refer to it as a statue of me and Sidon rather than as Sidon and Link, unless this is actually part of Link's personality, which, as fascinating as that would be, is unlikely. And considering that this isn't the only quest that does this, there are several others too. The entries in the adventure log of Tears of the Kingdom, therefore, reads to me as much more generic overall. While you could still choose to read the entries from Link's perspective in Japanese, the inclusion of quests that mention Link's name feel, for lack of a better word, jarring to read this way. On top of that, there is a clear difference between the amount of expressive language used in the adventure log of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, coupled with the multiple appearances of Link's name in the text. Breath of the Wild's log contains a number of lines that feel much more personal as they express a person's feelings or thoughts. Tears of the Kingdoms, however, does not have the same level of personality to be felt from the text. While it's true that the English version of Breath of the Wild's adventure log is missing multiple lines that are present in the original, the whole log being in the second person is not necessarily a mistranslation or translation error. In essence, this discrepancy arises from a fundamental difference between the Japanese and English languages, making it challenging to seamlessly transfer the nuances between the two. Consequently, while both versions offer distinct experiences, ultimately the decision is yours. You have the freedom to interpret it as Link's diary or to project your own persona onto him, utilizing his character as your personal link into the world of Zelda.